Hello and welcome to the Gaggle Global Challenge, and if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Szamuely, and I just want to say a few words about a topic that we have covered here many times before, namely United States hypocrisy on the International Criminal Court. You'll recall that the United States had originally been a signatory to the Rome Treaty, but Bill Clinton withdrew the Rome Treaty from ratification by Congress. And then subsequently, the George W. Bush administration withdrew its signature from the Rome Treaty. And then, during the Bush years, the Congress passed the Hague Rescue Act, whereby the United States arrogates itself the right to invade any country, and particularly Holland, that arrests any American pursuant to a warrant issued by the International Criminal Court. And then, of course, during the Trump years, the United States imposed sanctions on the ICC prosecutor, Bensouda, when she said, well, we might open an investigation into possible war crimes perpetrated by the United States in Afghanistan. Well, that was enough to impose sanctions and a ban on any visas to any ICC personnel coming to the United States. However, during these years, the United States was quite happy to support the ICC as long as the ICC targeted countries and leaders that the United States wanted to see targeted. And this was, of course, came very much to the fore during the NATO bombing of Libya, when the chief prosecutor at the time, Ocampo, issued arrest warrants, indictments and arrest warrants against Libya's leaders, including President Muammar Gaddafi. And the Obama administration cheered this on and used the issuance of these indictments and arrest warrants as vindication for its bombing assault on Libya, a country that had done nothing at all against the United States. And then, of course, we had the issue during the Biden years of the ICC issuing arrest warrants based on no evidence against President Putin, claiming that he had abducted children from Ukraine. Again, the Biden administration rejoiced, clapped its hands with glee, saw it as, again, vindication for its policy of sending arms to Ukraine. Well, now recently, the ICC, as you know, issued arrest warrants against Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu and the former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. And this has caused absolute fury, rage in the United States. I mean, it's much worse to issue arrest warrants against Israeli leaders than it is to issue arrest warrants against American leaders. I mean, it's bad enough when you threaten American leaders, and the ICC hasn't done anything like that. In the case of Bensouda, she just said she might open an investigation into possible war crimes perpetrated by the United States in Afghanistan. Said nothing at all about any American having committed a war crime. But here they came out and issued an arrest warrant against Bibi Netanyahu. So right away, Washington went into high gear and passed legislation, or rather moved legislation through Congress in order to sanction the ICC. And it passed the House quite comfortably. But now it's stalled in the Senate because there's some in the Senate who remember the good old days of using the ICC to bash purported adversaries of the United States. And they say, well, if we sanction the ICC, how are we going to use the propaganda that the ICC provides us with? How are we going to use any indictments and arrest warrants against our supposed adversaries? How are we going to use that for our political purposes? So we can't just simply go ahead and just sanction the ICC just because of what it's done to Bibi. So the Senate has stalled on passing this legislation. So let me just show you a couple of things. This is an article in Responsible Statecraft, and the Responsible Statecraft approves of what the Senate did, not and doesn't really see it as a total opportunism on their part, because they just want to use the ICC as a political weapon, not because they care about international justice or anything like that. I mean, they're in agreement on not not issuing any kind of indictments against Bibi Netanyahu. I mean, that of course the senators are outraged by that, but they don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I mean, even though the Americans are not a party to the Rome Statute, hey, the ICC is quite useful for us. It has this reputation, and we want to wrap ourselves up in this reputation whenever it's convenient for us. Now, let's keep in mind, the ICC has no international standing. It's not an agency of the United Nations in the way that the International Court of Justice is, the World Court, that is. This is just an ad hoc body that only has jurisdiction over states that sign on to the Rome Statute, or states that claim to be under attack, from somebody else, and therefore, once they've accepted the ICC statute, then they can demand that the ICC investigate their enemy, even though that enemy is not a member of the Rome Statute. So, for instance, the Palestinians, once they accepted the jurisdiction of the ICC, when they signed on to the Rome Statute, then they could ask the ICC to investigate possible Israeli war crimes. Same thing happened with Ukraine. Ukraine was not a signatory of the Rome Statute, but it accepted a very limited jurisdiction from the ICC, which enabled the ICC to come in and investigate supposed Russian war crimes. Anyway, here it says the Senate blocks poorly crafted ICC sanctions bill. Experts warn that the legislation may inhibit cases that the U.S. has supported elsewhere. Oh dear. And then it says the Senate voted against advancing H.R. 23, which would impose sanctions on the International Criminal Court to the Senate floor. This follows successful passage of the same bill in the House by a 243 to 140 vote earlier this month. The legislation is primarily a rebuke of the court for warrants issued in November for the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and former Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant for their alleged war crimes. And then he goes on, but it turns out the Republican sponsors could not rally the 60 votes to advance the bill to the Senate floor. Only one Democrat, Pennsylvania's John Fetterman, voted for them, resulting in a final tally of 54 to 45, but they needed the 60 votes, so it couldn't, they couldn't advance it. It says some Democrats have expressed support for legislation, sanctioning the ICC, but believe the current bill is too broad, or as Minority Leader Chuck Schumer indicated, poorly crafted and deeply problematic. Again, notice what they've done here. They say, we're all for sanctions against the ICC, but we want to maintain the ICC and make sure it doesn't go after Israel, it doesn't go after the United States, but it does go after Russia. That's the key here. And so that's why it's poorly crafted and deeply problematic. And it says, New Hampshire Senator Jeanne Shaheen, a top Democrat on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, spearheaded negotiations with Republicans over some of the bill's broad language and provisions. She and other Democrats were worried that the legislation, as written, could harm American tech contractors and companies that do business with the ICC, and the Senate should amend legislation to protect these actors. So again, we have American tech contractors. So Americans were very actively doing business with the ICC, even though the United States is not a signatory of the Rome Statute. Humanitarian agencies have also expressed concern over the bill's potentially broad implications. Over 130 organizations sent a letter. Now, these 130 organizations include the usual suspects in Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Open Society Initiative, you name them, they're there. Those are, it's very much the war crimes human rights brigade. Sent a letter to Congress and the incoming administration urging other governments, members of Congress, and advocates for victims everywhere to raise their voices to oppose attacks on the independence and autonomy of international judicial institutions like the ICC. Well, if you just unpack that, first of all, the ICC is not independent and it doesn't have autonomy. It's if you just look at whom it has targeted, then we can say that it has a distinct political direction. Most of its indictees have been the states in Africa, because ultimately it's easy to push Africans around. They're not very strong, and they don't have anyone who's going to go into bat for them. So it's Africa. Whenever they do investigate any of the Western powers, any of the usual NATO crowd, these investigations just go on forever. And in the end, either they decide, as they did in the case of Great Britain, these alleged crimes, they just don't rise to the level of gravity to justify continuing with this investigation, or subsequently, because these investigations of Great Britain went on for a while, subsequently said, well, Britain, because it's a democracy and has an independent judiciary, we can rely on the British judicial authorities to conduct their own rigorous, probative investigation and punish any possible war crimes by citizens of Great Britain. And therefore, they eventually didn't do anything about the investigation of British war crimes in Iraq. And in fact, the British didn't really do anything about their own people and any possible war crimes they committed. But apart from anything else, the courts are not supposed to be independent. I mean, courts are part of a political systems, and they have to be ultimately answerable to somebody. You can't have courts that are not answerable to political powers, because then you have judges running amok. And no one at any time, no political philosopher, no, and definitely not the founders of the United States, and no legal scholar has ever argued that courts have to be completely independent of political authorities, because judges are as human as anyone else, and they cannot just be allowed to run rampant, unsupervised, and unaccountable to anyone. And this is what we had at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, that he wasn't answerable to anyone. So they could do anything at all. They could commit any injustice at all, send political leaders that they didn't like to life imprisonment or 45 years in prison, using highly dubious jurisprudence and using extremely dubious judgments to do so. And there was ultimately no one could do anything about it because, hey, it's independent. Hey, they're not answerable to anyone. Well, you can't have that. You always have to have courts answerable to someone. And that's why in any political system, United States or anywhere else, the ultimate authority goes to the civilian political authorities that are accountable. So however bad some judgments are issued by the courts, there is always a remedy, which is presidents, heads of state, heads of government have the power to pardon, to grant amnesty, whatever the rogue judges may have performed, and they have the power to reform a thoroughly corrupt judicial system, as should be done now in the United States when you have things like the DC court, the DC circuits, the Manhattan courts, the various other courts that we've now seen in recent years, where you have, again, rogue political judges who are using the powers that has been granted to them to imprison their political adversaries. Clearly, we can't allow that. So any talk about the independence of an international judicial institutions, we need to stay the hell away from any talk like that. Anyway, the letter points out that dismissing the ICC authority would undermine attempts to curb crimes against humanity in other countries where the United States has sided with the court. Well, of course, we have to support the ICC when it's batting on the same side as the United States, such as in cases against Putin in Russia and Sudan. ICC sanctions send a signal that could embolden authoritarian regimes and others with reason to fear accountability who seek to evade justice. And again, it always assumes that the ICC, the ICTY, the ICTR, and all these entities that have been created over the past few decades provide justice. They don't provide justice. They are utterly politicized. And they're worse than no justice because they use the paraphernalia of justice, courts, judges, wearing these fancy uniforms. They all wear these very fancy clothes, maybe wear a hat, maybe a wig, even better. The British judges usually like to wear wigs as well, even though when they appear at these international bodies. And they have this gravitas, this pomposity that suggests to an undiscerning public that somehow there's justice being meted out here. No, they have nothing to do with justice. And so therefore, the idea that there's any kind of accountability is nonsensical. It's untrue. And the way you can tell it's untrue is the work of the ICTY. The ICTY operated for 25 years, starting in 1993 to about 2018. For 25 years, sending people to prison for decades, if not the rest of their lives, um, on the basis of no justice. Anyway, it says experts have also warned, oh, this is always good, whenever we hear about the experts, who are these experts? Experts have also warned that sanctions could inhibit current investigations into other governments allied with the United States. In the Philippines, for example, the ICC is investigating extrajudicial killings that took place under former President Rodrigo Duterte. This is, again, the kind of thing the ICC does, sanctioned by the United States, when it goes after political leaders who fell out with Washington. And Duterte goes back a number of years, and he was president of the Philippines, and it was a particular bête noire of Washington for years. And so now the ICC is investigating, extrajudicial killings. And are allegedly occurring to this day as a consequence of Duterte's harsh war on drugs. Again, Philippines is a sovereign country, and sovereign countries should be allowed to pursue their own domestic agenda. I mean, if a country believes that it's suffering under the scourge of drugs, and many countries believe, incidentally, that drugs are just destroying their societies, then you ultimately say, I mean, however, there may be extrajudicial killings, there may be terrible things done in the name of this war, it's still ultimately a sovereign decision as to what policies the government pursues in its war on drugs. It may be different from the policy of the United Kingdom or policy of Italy or policy of the United States, but nonetheless, it falls within the sovereign bailiwick of any country to decide, well, what are your main priorities, and it should not be up to the ICC, which is apparently independent, to decide what are appropriate and not appropriate measures to take. Anyway, this is the open letter, and it has the usual cast of characters. And there you are. The undersigned organization's right to express grave concerns and to unequivocally oppose the use of sanctions authority of the United States to attack the ICC, an independent judicial authority dedicated to combining impunity for the gravest crimes known to humanity. That's always that thing about the combating impunity. And again, whenever we've seen the operation of these international independent judicial bodies, it's only fostered impunity because certain people ended up in prison. Other people, got to live out their lives in peaceful retirement. And then, as usual, the ICC performs a vital role in international affairs by investigating the worst international crimes that shock the collective conscience of humanity. This is familiar fluff. And investigating those accused of committing those crimes. It does so in a manner that protects the due process rights of the accused. No, it does not. The sovereignty of state. No, it does not. Including, again, it violates the sovereignty of states and the rights of victims. And again, the whole thing about rights of victims is a misnomer, but they like to talk about, well, international justice is about its victims' justice. No such thing as victims' justice. It was an invention of the Human Rights Brigade. As has been widely observed, supporting the work of the court in the interest of the United States is in the interest of the United States. Well, successive U.S. administrations, successive U.S. politicians have disagreed that it's in the interest of the United States, and neither Democrat nor Republican has ever supported the ICC other than to use it against adversaries. So this is this cutesy way of formulating it is in the interest of the United States. The positive role of the ICC has been recognized through previous bipartisan support for investigation into war crimes allegedly perpetrated by Russian officials in the Ukraine conflict, attempts to bring justice for the victims of gross human rights violations in Myanmar, and pathway to accountability for perpetrators of atrocities in Sudan. So that's it. So yeah, look, Americans have supported the ICC in those cases, and that seems to be an argument. Well, therefore, the ICC is a good thing. No, it was always hypocritical when the United States did that. The United States should not have done that. In fact, no one should support the ICC. It's essentially it's a fraudulent process, and any attempt at this, and we've not gone beyond that. This kind of international judicial accountability has not gone beyond the problem that we knew from Nuremberg. And the problem that we knew from Nuremberg, and it was enunciated by many people, not Nazi sympathizers or anything else. They said, hey, this is victor's justice. The victors get to put the vanquished on trial. And then they kind of invent charges, they invent a jurisprudence to justify their cause. So the message really is, don't ever fall for the ICC. If you go down that path and saying, well, I may not like the ICC, but I really support what it's doing on Israel, because it's very good that we're putting Netanyahu on notice, and we're really going to hold Israelis to account. Don't fall for that, because once you allow the ICC to worm its way in, once you permit the ICC to posture as a kind of fount of credibility, once you do that, you've given the ICC the mantle of the scrupulous judicial body that's meting out justice, that's meting out defense for the victims. It's nothing of the sort. So it's always a mistake to do this selective thing. Oh, well, I like it when he does this. I just don't like it when he does that. The ICC, like all of these other ad hoc judicial bodies, are a mechanism for the international community, otherwise known as the Western powers led by the United States. It's a mechanism for them to intervene in the internal affairs of other countries. It's known as interventionism by any other way. And it's the liberal humanitarian human rights brigade version of interventionism. It's different from Trump's. Trump's is more about, well, if it's good for the United States, then we should just do it. They don't do that, but it's the result is the same. They just do it with the human rights as the basis for interventionism. So it's now come out in the open. The House, in a fit of fury, passed this legislation sanctioning the ICC, but the Senate said, well, we don't like the ICC doing this to Israel, but we do like the ICC when he does any of those other things. If you go down this path, you're giving legitimacy to the ICC. No one should ever do that. So anyway, that was my short take on the ICC. And remember, if you like the gaggle, please like, share, and subscribe. See you soon.